Good evening, it's Dr. Rachel Stewart. I'm one of the medical legal advisors at the Medical Defence Unit. I'm absolutely delighted tonight to be joined by Dr. Naomi Elton and Dr. Caroline Elton, who are going to discuss making wise career choices. So I'll pass over to them in a second, but just before they do, I will just go through some quick housekeeping points. So if I could ask you to please submit any questions into the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screens, and then at the end, Naomi, Caroline, and myself will try to get through as many as we can. Along the top right of your screen, you can access different tools we have available for the live webinar, such as feedback form and a help guide. We'd be really grateful for your thoughts, along with a help guide for any tech issues. You'll receive a certificate of attendance via email within 5 days of the webinar, and this webinar will also be recorded, and the on-demand version will be available to watch on our MDU website. If you're experiencing any tech issues tonight, if we could ask you to please leave and rejoin the webinar using the same link. You can refer to the help button at the top right or the PDF linked in the resources box. And with that, I will pass over to Naomi and Caroline to begin.
Thank you, Rachel. I'll just briefly introduce myself. I'm Caroline Elton, and I'm an occupational psychologist by training, and I have specialised for the last 30 odd years in medical careers.
And I'm Naomi Elton, and I'm a retired child psychiatrist, and in recent years have been coaching doctors on careers and have also been a psychotherapist.
And it's probably worth saying that Naomi and I share a very similar outlook in life. We share the same surname, and we are bizarrely not related. So what are we going to cover in this webinar? The first and perhaps the most important thing is we're going to introduce a structured approach to career planning, and it's an approach that you can use right the way throughout your career. And it's quite likely that nobody's ever given you any guidance on how you can think about and plan your career. We're going to talk about how you can work out what's most important to you about your work, and how you can then explore all the available options, how you can match the available options against your own personal work needs. Briefly, we're going to talk about why it's really vital that you have a plan A and plan B, and then at the end of it, to make sure that all of this good stuff doesn't fall into a black hole when you go back to the demands of your everyday life. We're going to ask you to identify 3 career-related actions that you will take. We're going to talk for about 45 minutes. We'll include 2 interactive polls. Then there'll be a question and answer for 15 minutes. And please do post questions or comments at any time in the Q&A box. So let's kick off with the first poll. What stage are you currently in your career decision making? Please just look at the different options, and we'll give you 30 seconds to a minute just to vote. Over half of you have now voted. $35 of 50.
I like that people are putting a bit of thought into it, actually, and that chimes really well with some of the messages of the webinar.
We've got 75% of attendees, so I think we'll get up to about 80.
Of course, it's not compulsory to vote.
You don't. You don't have to. But of course, the numbers of people logging in keep on going up as well. We started off with 48, but now we've got 52. Once we get to 80% of attendees having voted, okay, let's move on to the next one. So, okay, 11.6 of you feel you have a career plan. Now, obviously, that may be one of the reasons why you decided to come on today's webinar. The largest group are those of you who feel you have a couple of options and you're trying to choose between them. That's really helpful for us to know. Some of you feel that there's several options you're trying to choose between. 16% I've managed to eliminate some, and then a relatively small number saying I don't yet have any sort of plan as to what to do next. So this notion then of trying to choose between options is obviously really key to nearly half of the audience. Naomi, over to you.
Okay, so we couldn't resist to put an image of the book that we've recently written because we will be doing a couple of exercises. All of the material that we're going to be using today is in the book. And we've worked quite hard together with our publisher to make sure that the book gets into hospital libraries. Good place for us to start is to think about how career planning is sort of done. And it's really why I think Caroline devised the method in the first place and why we wrote the book. Because doctors that Caroline and more lately both of us have been talking to have been telling us that this is how career planning unfortunately happens, sort of on the back of an envelope. And it also happens very rapidly, sometimes in quite random moments. It might happen sometimes on the back of an envelope, sometimes just in your head. And there'll always be a looming deadline. Another feature is that people will often home in on the specialties that they've had exposure to, either as an undergraduate or as an F1 or F2 or F3 doctor. And why does that? Why does it matter to do the planning in that way? And the real reason is because I suppose it doesn't. It stands to reason that if you're going to plan it in that way, because there's been so very little training out there available, then it's very likely that a mismatch will occur between the person on the one hand and the needs of the job role that they're going into on the other. And unfortunately, we know from studies beyond the UK, there isn't much literature on UK doctors, but between about 10 and 15% of doctors experience some level of career regret. And we also know that career regret, it correlates with symptoms of burnout. So the good news is that we can do something about that. And even better news is that you can use a structured approach, which Caroline's devised, which is really very similar to the approach that you will use in ordinary clinical practice.
So I'm not a clinician, I'm a psychologist, but I've worked in medical education for a very long time, including in an earlier role, actually doing a lot of clinical observation. And I've taught communication skills. So although I haven't never worked as a clinician, I've seen the teaching of this structure. And this is how, whatever your specialty, whichever roles you're in now as foundation doctors or F3 doctors, whatever clinical fellows, whatever your specialty, you're going to be doing some variant of this. And you don't do it backwards. You don't work out the clinical management before any sense of diagnosis, investigations, and it doesn't make sense. You have to do it in a structured way. And as an occupational psychologist who was familiar with the most common structure for guiding people through career decisions, it struck me that really the two are there's a parallel. You start off by really thinking not about the options out there, but about yourself and who you are in terms of your work needs. And that is the bit that is so often missed out by doctors. Then you explore options, shortlist, and it seems like quite a lot of people are in this stage already, although they may have got to the shortlist without doing a lot of self-knowledge. Then you would investigate the favoured options, career decision, and then implement your plan. But often doctors go straight to the plan and implement. What do I need to do to succeed in an interview for internal medicine? How do I need to build my portfolio for that without necessarily doing any of the work that comes before it? So sorry, I think
that's me, isn't it? But can I just add that because you would never actually start a clinical care episode with management, you will always go through the stages. So, and the same, I suppose what we're arguing is the same should be true for career planning. Just the same, you should afford yourself the same level of respect and planning that you would the care of your patient. So we turn to psychologist Kahneman, who wrote a very well-known book, Thinking Fast and Slow. It's a percolation of a vast amount of psychology, sort of cognitive psychology, decision-making psychology, empirical evidence over many decades. And he managed to basically summarize the whole of this part of psychology in terms of by saying that we think in two different ways. We either think in what he calls system one style, which is about being very fast, using a lot of cognitive biases, cognitive shortcuts, and quite often doing several things all in parallel. And then you've got system two thinking, which is that much slower, more effortful type of thinking, one task carried out at a time, and has the quality of reflection and weighing things up. And clearly we need to move from system one thinking, the back of the envelope type of thinking, into a sort of system two mode, and which is why we've put in this structure that is following the sort of clinical care type of structure. And Kahneman with his colleagues, wrote a second book, which is just as helpful. And it takes us towards sort of thinking how to use the structure to best advantage. And they say, in relation to a big decision, you're going to break it down into smaller sub-decisions. And then for each of them, you're going to give rankings and scorings wherever possible. Another really important facet of the decision hygiene is that you're going to delay intuition. You're going to delay making an integrated impression until all of the data is in, or until you've done all of your research. It's argued that we do need intuition. It's not that it's not valuable, but we mustn't allow it to come along prematurely.
So let's just turn to the structure. The first thing is self-knowledge, really, and I see this as really, if the clinical parallel is taking the patient history, self-knowledge is taking your own educational and career history. So there's really the question of what are the different aspects of your education and career that you need to think about. And as a minimum, you need to think about work values. What's most important to you about work? And this is an area that is often really overlooked because medicine is a very academic training, and often people are sort of drawn into thinking about their academic achievements, but rather than thinking about what is actually most important to them about the work. You need to think too about what you find genuinely interesting. We are not all interested in the same things. If you ask your colleagues, if you ask friends, family, you may find the things that they're most interested in are very different. You need to think about what you excel at because you want to play to your strongest suit. What feedback have you got that others have noticed you excel at? And then you need to flip that over. What are some of the things that you really struggle at that don't seem to come naturally to you because you don't want to build a career on that? And then you also need to bear in mind what are the things that you find particularly stressful. Now, you may not be able to come up with a career where they're an option where there's none of that, but you want to minimize that. You don't want the sort of scenarios that you find particularly stressful to be the bread and butter of your work. So the self-knowledge exercises, which you can do, we're just going to outline them quite briefly today, but hopefully there's a copy of the book in the medical school library. Looks at values. It asks you to do a career lifeline, where again you're looking at the highs and lows throughout your career. There's some writing exercises, some drawing exercises, spending some time really thinking about the things. It's not necessarily the things that others would say are the most extraordinary, but the achievements that have given you the most personal satisfaction. And also we will be looking at the experience log. So today we're going to just have a brief introduction to 2 of those exercises, but there are more of these exercises in the book, should you be so interested. So, work values. There are 36 values, and they're specific to medicine, and the aim is that you categorize them. Very important, quite important, not important, and it's important that they're not there. And then what you can do is home in on the very important values, and also look at the values that are important that are absent from work, that you don't want to have being a consistent feature of your working life. Now, this is all of the values that we have in the book. I'll just give you a moment to look at those. And things like job security, whether you enjoy teamwork, variety, intensity, status, all the sort of different things, flexibility. And then what we've done here is here's a poll for, we've just taken a subset, I think it's 10, is that 12, right? Oh, 12, yeah, sorry, 12. And just what we'd like you to do is select the 3 that seem most important to you currently. And in the way we've done the exercise in the book is that you can cut them out, rearrange them, so you can also think about currently and then how things may alter, let's say in 5 years' time. But just do the poll with which exercise, which 3 are most important to you currently. Yeah. 35% have voted. 65%. No, nearly 70 now. Just wait to get to 80. Completely arbitrary number on my part. We'll wait for one more person.
No pressure.
No pressure. Okay. You can, as Rachel said right at the beginning, the slides are available, so you can go back and do these in your own time. So Naomi said to me, whispered to me, work-life balance would be the most, and that's 87.5. Opportunity to provide, and these are going to be, because they're free, it's going to be more than 100%. Opportunity to provide continuity of care, teamwork, job security, working for a particular geographical location, something about variety, working in a highly competitive specialty, 0%. Nobody on this seminar today or particularly seems to have wanted that. But the important point is you need to think about this. And as the slides are available, in fact, all the values, you can see them and you can copy them down on bits of paper and do the same exercise, not with a third of the set of values, but with the whole set. So Naomi, over to you.
Okay, so that's one of the exercises that will go towards creating a picture of your, we call it self-knowledge, your history of yourself. And the other one is the experience log, which I think a lot of doctors quite enjoy doing and find it quite easy to fit it into their working week, because you can just fill in one row per day, perhaps. And it just really asks you to write down a little episode of something that you did in the day. Describe how you felt doing either during or after that little episode, and give it a rating. In the spirit of decision hygiene, you're going to give it a rating on a 0 to 10 scale. The example here that on this slide is a real example. Somebody who gave a rating of -10 off the scale because they were doing all of their CPD late at night when their child was asleep, and they'd done all their clinic letters, GP surgery letters, done all the blood, checked all the results and things like that. But then the next day, that person did rate the experience that they'd had at 8 on the 0 to 10 scale. And it was a simple situation of having got a patient better quickly and effectively from their chest infection. And we always encourage people as they're doing each exercise to try to get all of the data down on one page. You might call it a dashboard if you were being grand. And you're basically trying on one page to answer the question, what am I like? And the corollary, what does work need to be like for me?
So that's a whistle-stop tour through stage 1. Next, we're going to move on to exploring the options. So these are just some websites that we would recommend. The HEE one, the first one is the person spec, but the www.healthcareers, the third one, actually lists pretty much all the 65 or 66 specialties. It's a very good starting point. And I suspect that there are many specialties that you've never even heard of. And it can be worth thinking about that. Particularly these tend to be smaller specialties that you won't have encountered, or you may well not have encountered at medical school or as part of foundation. These are all reputable websites. In addition, some of the other Royal Colleges have very good websites too. The final website that we've listed is where the data is for the new prioritization system that is being used in terms of international medical graduates. And that's laid out very clearly in the final website, if that's relevant to anybody. So,
oh, okay. So yes, now this is very fast, a lot faster than is sensible in one evening. But here we are. So we're going to move on to how to investigate the favoured options that you might have if once you'd clicked around on all of those websites and looked at all those specialties, the ones that you might not have yet encountered. And the method that we most heartily recommend is the informational interview. And we regard it as an antidote to being online, which obviously you can't really avoid being online and doing all that clicking around that we've recommended just a moment ago, because that's where the information is. But the problem with it is that it is a kind of shop window, that the website will have been curated to make the, to get as greater buy-in from doctors as possible. And in a way, you need to go beyond that. And you've done your self-knowledge, you've done that history taking from yourself, and you know what you now need from work. So the question is, does this job measure up to your needs? So the method is to interview a person who knows the specialty well. And it can be quite hard to think of an appropriate person. You may want it to be somebody that's been in the specialty for very many years. You might prefer it to be a person who is quite a senior registrar in that specialty, and someone that you feel that you can talk with frankly about the specialty. And the method is that you will design the questions before the interview, before you interview the person. You might use some quite generic questions, the sorts of questions that could be asked to anybody from any specialty, but there will be some that you will design specifically around your own particular needs and self-knowledge. So this slide is really just to sort of encourage you to move away from the sort of back of the envelope style of informational interview that we very often come across. It's sort of where you might ask to speak to somebody, and then you might just say to them, oh, well, how do you get into the specialty? That's the most common question probably that's asked in career planning. And of course, the person will say, well, do X, Y, and Z. You can choose between pathway A, pathway B. But of course, by asking this particular question, you are going straight to the implementation. It's the equivalent of jumping in with the management of the patient before you've even asked a history. So, as I mentioned, there'll be some generic questions. What gives you the greatest job satisfaction? What causes the greatest amount of stress, even amongst experienced consultants? Things like this. And they would be good for any specialty or any person. But there may be particular questions that you've designed around your particular needs. So, for example, a doctor might feel that they want to be mostly ward-based. They'd like their job to be ward-based, and they're interacting with staff and patients in that sort of ward-esque kind of way. Or contrarily, they might prefer to be predominantly clinic-based. Or let's imagine they've trained in medical education to a very high level, and they may really want to have opportunities to put their medical education training into practice on a week-to-week or even day-to-day basis. So these are just examples from doctors that we've worked with.
Yeah, we should say these are real examples. And I think the important point is about starting off, as Naomi said, with general questions, but then you really want to hone them down to questions that are specific to your own work needs.
And just as we did before, where we said that we encourage doctors to try to create a sort of dashboard. Here we encourage you to sort of keep almost like a kind of log, really, of the research that you do, so you don't lose any of the data. So I've kind of put up on this little imaginary table specialties that I might have been interested to explore and investigate: child psychiatry, adult psychiatry, and so on. And we encourage you to make comments and give a score as you're going, really, as you're doing your online exploration and when you've done the informational interview for each thing. So you're basically describing what the work, how the job role might measure up to the requirements that you have got for work.
So then you get to crunch point, and it seems actually based on the initial poll of where you are with your career planning, that not many of you actually feel that you're in that point now where you feel ready to make a career decision.
And let's just go back to the decision hygiene slide that we saw earlier. You'll remember that Kahneman said you're going to break down the decision, you're going to make some ratings and things like that. And you mustn't use intuition prematurely. So now is the time, once you have done a variety of the exercises and you've taken the proper history, done the exploration and investigation, now is the time when you can use intuition. If used prematurely, it will lead you to jump to conclusions, but now is not the time. It's not premature any longer. Yeah. Not everybody finds that intuition is forthcoming. Sometimes it seems evasive and you're left with a couple of options and you really don't know which one to pick. And I think then the good news is that there is help at hand, which is that you can put some structure into the decision-making process. And an options appraisal is as good as any. It just really is a list of what the options are, what the arguments are for and against each option, ideally a score for each option and a comment as to why you did the score the way you did it.
So backup plans. I think that when it comes to very competitive specialties, there can be a sense that people think you have to say it's hematology. It's always been hematology. I used to paint spots on my teddy bear when I was 3. It's the only thing I've ever been interested in. And there's a fantasy sometimes that that's what, if you have an interview process or whatever, they are expecting that level of dedication. But the psychological reality is that people are suited to more than one specialty. And more than one specialty will meet your needs. Now, what's the evidence for that? Over the years, we've worked with, there's not much research evidence on this question, but over the years, we've worked with doctors who've had to change specialty. and maybe they've had to change specialty because of a health issue. So I've worked with pathologists losing their eyesight, as an example. So maybe there's a health reason why they've had to change specialty, and sometimes there's a geographical reason. I've also worked with doctors who are going to work maybe in a developing country where they don't have clinical neurophysiology or whatever it is, and that's what they had got some way into training, and then they've moved with a partner to a country where that specialty doesn't exist, and they've had to do another something else, and they've enjoyed that. So I think it can be quite liberating to realize that psychologically, it's probably not the case that there's one specialty for you and only one specialty for you. And it always, and interviews are selection processes, they always have a slightly random element in them. And so to have a plan and a backup is just good career planning practice.
Okay, so do you remember that intuition must be delayed until the data's in, until the research has been done? Well, the same is true of using other people's opinions, and that may seem really kind of quite counterintuitive. The common sense idea, I suppose, is that, yeah, talk to lots of different people. But we consider that career planning, and certainly the research aspect of it, of course, it does have built into it an element of talking to people in that sort of very structured, organized way. But we strongly recommend thinking of it as a kind of solitary activity. It can also be helpful to remind yourself about whose career it is actually to do with. It's your career, and think also about who may be affected by your choice, because there may be another person who's got to find their career and at the same time as you, and finally to try to sort of drill down a little bit about what other people's opinions may be based on. Sometimes people's opinions as to what you should be choosing may be based upon unreliable information or assumptions, fears, or even family tradition.
I had the conversation with a client about this today, and what I think is really important to think, we're not saying that other people in your life aren't important. We're not, absolutely not saying that. We are saying, first of all, sort out what you want and then have the discussion with other people, rather than too early on talking about the plans and then you lose sight of really thinking through what you want. So sort out your own career needs and then talk to others. And then finally, we get to, when we're talking about implementing your career plan, these are some of the top one has all the information about the person specs for different and the different training routes for different specialties. And that can be very helpful. These are all reliable, useful websites. Something that I often say is don't get careers advice from people who are not currently involved in recruitment and selection, particularly when it comes to what you need to do, because the rules and the regs, the person specs, they change every year, and you really need to make sure that the information that you've got is accurate and it's up to date. So this is some help, some reliable websites that you can use when it comes to implementing your career plan. Oh, sorry, we've gone to one slide. So now it's back to you, and we would like you to just spend a couple of minutes to make it's not a detailed career action plan, but to to think of 3 career-related actions that you're now going to take, and if you can, assign a completion date. That might be thinking about your work values. It might be doing it might relate to the first stage of self-knowledge. It might relate to some broad reading around exploring options, or it might relate to more detailed research around a smaller set. It might range to arranging an informational interview or looking at the person specs. Whatever it is, we're just going to give you a couple of minutes to identify 3 career-related tasks that you're now going to do, linked to the material that we've covered. And if you want to, please do feel free to put them in the Q&A, if you not because they are questions, but because we can then just get some sense of what it is that you're writing about. But we'll just give you a couple of minutes to do that before we move into the questions. We
could have a look, couldn't we?
Good. Okay.
Couldn't read all
What was first? Yeah, that was.
Okay. Shall we,
Yeah.
go to...
Yeah. Okay. I hope you've identified at least a couple of tasks, and now it's time to put us in the hot seat and see if we can answer some questions. Rachel, Father Matas.
Yeah, so one of the ones we've had in the last couple of minutes was someone was asking about how this would apply to neurodiverse doctors and whether you thought there was any modification they would need to make in this scenario. So I suppose in terms of for neurodiverse doctors who are, thinking about what career they'd like to go into, do you think there's something specific?
I wondered if the question might mean whether the approach is appropriate.
Well, maybe we can answer both.
Yes.
Do you want to talk about the approach?
Well, I think the approach is really well suited to neurodiverse doctors because I think it's always helpful to have a structure. And I think if you're neurodiverse, the last thing you want is to have to do the whole of career planning on the back of an envelope.
I would also add in that there's a wonderful organisation called Autistic Doctors International. I don't know if the person who's asked about this is aware of that organisation. They've done some very interesting research, and they also challenge the idea that neurodiverse, obviously neurodiversity spans more than autism, but in terms of autism, they span the idea that they dispel the idea that you've got to be a pathologist and you can't be a psychiatrist and you can't be a GP or whatever. I think it's really a question of the structure, as Naomi said, is particularly appropriate because you can use it to think about what are the things you excel at, what are the ways in which your neurodiversity is a strength, and then be asking in your career exploration if those sorts of tasks, situations, patients, whatever, are going to be part of the job. And then you do need to flip that over and think, what are the things that I find very challenging? And then you need to make sure that this isn't a mainstream component of that job.
Great, that's really interesting. So we've had someone else say that they find it very interesting to hear about the different systems of thinking. And they're asking whether you could speak a little bit more about how they can move towards a systems 2 thinking when thinking about career options, especially with such a busy lifestyle as FY doctors. So I'm assuming this person's a foundation trainee.
So I mean, I think that the whole of the method is systems 2 thinking. So I suppose the method is it's decision hygiene that is system 2 thinking, and the back of the envelope is system 1 thinking. So it's a bit like following an algorithm in your clinical care, and doing all the things in the correct order. And this structure is the system 2. So,
and I think linked to that, allowing time for it, not leaving it to the last moment is really critical, and not doing any of these preparatory tasks in the structure, not doing it when you're exhausted either. So little bits often is better, and this, depending on where you are and the decisions you're facing, this may not be very welcome news, but really trying to give the time that it requires, rather than leaving it to the very last moment. And my heart would always sink when I rang the careers unit and somebody would ring me up and say, I've got to make a decision tomorrow. And almost by dint of the fact that you knew that they'd left it to the last minute to get in contact with you or to do anything about it, you knew you weren't going to be able to help that much. So I think, as Naomi said, the structure is system 2, and slowly work your way through it.
Do you find, I find when I'm coaching doctors that a doctor might need about a month to do 2 exercises. It can be that slow because of how busy you are.
Yeah, so that point of really taking time to go through the process and not rushing it. So we've had a question about, what do you do if you've got an offer for the specialty you want, but it's not in the right place geographically? And then we've had a question which is sort of similar to that, but also asks about, I suppose we're aware that more and more doctors are applying for more than one perhaps specialty training program. So maybe you've got an offer for a specialty you did want, but it's not in the right part of the country, and then you might have an offer for a specialty that wasn't your first choice, but is where you want to be, I suppose, within the country.
So
you go.
Okay. There's no right or wrong answer here. This is a personal choice. Actually, I think the most useful exercise here is the work values one, because how important is it for you to be in a particular location? For some people, you need to think about what keeps the show on the road for you. What is it that makes your work sustainable, your life sustainable? And if you have dependents, then it's also thinking about your family. Some people may decide at the end of the day that actually not moving their children from school, or not compromising the way that they and siblings are contributing to the care of a sick family member is more important for them than choosing the absolutely what they see as the perfect specialty. It's a question of really doing some quite hard thinking about what are the things that are most important for you. And you do need to make getting into a specialty training program, that's just the beginning. It's got to be sustainable once you're there. And by thinking back to what are the things that have kept the show on the road for you, if it is a set of close network of friends who are in a particular location, and you think back and think, actually, I would have been miserable without that. You need to be very careful about putting yourself in a situation where you haven't got that. For other people, that may not be the case. There are no easy answers, I think, on that one, other than really thinking about what's most important to you.
Yeah, so another question we've had from someone was about, they've said that where there's a specific specialty that's a family tradition and it's a good specialty, how should they decide between that if there's another one that they find more intellectually interesting but they're worried might be replaced with AI? So I suppose that's quite a specific question, but it perhaps speaks to how do you navigate perhaps that tension.
I mean, I would say the informational interview, but I suppose, I think it would be valuable to try not to interview a family member.
Well, also, at the end of the day, who's the person who's doing that job? It's you who's doing that job. Of course, you want the backup from your family. As for the role of AI in a specialty, it's important to do your research, and in some specialties, I don't know, maybe diagnostic specialties, we can imagine that the role of AI may be becoming more important. But I think sometimes the dealer and say, I will need to future-proof my career, and they would then get an Elton rant, Caroline Elton rant. Naomi rant about there's all things you have to do, not that you should do, but you cannot future-proof your career. Nobody can you don't know what's going to actually happen to the job, and you don't know what's going to happen to you. So you've got to do a reasonable amount, but it's a fantasy to think that you can future-proof.
So someone has said, do you have any advice for those who may have had a set idea during medical school of a specialty, perhaps it was intuitional? Would you recommend starting over again with the values exercise?
Absolutely. Do you agree? Yeah. I mean, a set idea, I mean, that's a classic romance almost, isn't it?
Early romance.
Yeah. And that, I mean, but it could be the one.
Yeah.
It could be. It really could be the one. But there are 65 approximately specialties and subspecialties. And it's definitely worth whizzing through that list that Caroline mentioned. And, just quickly clicking on all of them and having a look and see what else is out there.
It's also important to realise that there are pulls. Career indecision, not knowing, is psychologically quite aversive. Plus, not only is it uncomfortable not to know yourself, but also those in your network also want you to know very often, a partner or parents or siblings, friends. And so there's a tremendous draw, and sometimes it can be to premature foreclosure of making that decision. So it's not that we're saying discount that early thing, but interrogate it. Don't just take it as it is.
Yeah, yes, so re-examining that sort of initial thought to make sure it's the right one and not, as you say, pushing for closure. We've had a question about how does one tackle a career pivot outside of clinical medicine?
Okay.
And are there resources and services that exist to guide doctors on that path?
I mean, we've put a chapter in the book about that, about non-medical careers. And I think we found that it quite hard to write that chapter in terms of signposting people to resources, because it's so kind of the non-medical careers, it's very much more scattered around online, isn't it?
I mean, there is an organisation, Medic Footprints. They're a commercial organisation, and I don't know how good they are. And there are also, in terms of moving into pharma, there's only Medic. So there are some quick Google search, and we do talk about those. it's a big decision. Sometimes it's the right decision, and I've certainly coached doctors and helped them, as Naomi has, to make that decision. But very often when one is unhappy at work, one can think, I need to get out of this, and it is possible that maybe a smaller career shift would be the right one, but for some people, it definitely is, and I think it's really a question of the self-knowledge. If when you do that self-knowledge, if there's nothing in the experience log that you're enjoying, if the values don't really seem to be particularly related to medicine, it kind of comes out there. If you think about the achievements, there's nothing you're really proud of, there's nothing that really interests you, then at that point, I mean, of course, that can also be a product of depression. So you do need to ask yourself if you're in the right mental state for making that decision as well.
Great. So I'm going to, we've had a couple of questions that sort of center around I suppose, concerns about finding employment during their sort of FY3, FY4 years, and gaining relevant experience in the specialties they hope to pursue when there are limited job opportunities available to meet the criteria for specialty training. And so I wonder if you had any advice, I suppose, for doctors with how do they, I suppose, balance what we've discussed tonight about how to find the right career for them with those sort of pressures in terms of actually needing a job to, I suppose, to pay the bills and to have that career security.
So it's a question about how to get the experience during the F3 or F4 period.
I think it's about how to do so when there are sort of limited opportunities with the competition, I suppose, for jobs. And then someone has also asked about, you have said, how, do you have any advice for doctors who are worried about finding employment during their FY3 years?
I'm not sure how, I don't think there is actually such medical unemployment. You may not be able to get a job in the specialty you want or in the location, in the perfect location, but I think that there are still jobs at clinical fellow F3, F4 level. And so it may be the kind of, the first thing I'd say is having a bit of flexibility geographically and in terms of the actual job role. If you want to get experience in a specialty, but you can't get clinical experience, go and make those sorts of links that Naomi was talking about and find other ways. Is there some research or an audit or something that is going on? Could you contribute some teaching on that specialty for medical students or whatever it is? So make some social networking links, even if you can't get your foot through the door in terms of paid employment, and then that may open up the sort of opportunity that you can then use, add to your portfolio.
Yeah, so that might be about getting a clinical attachment or something like that. And I suppose study the job and person specs so that you really are crystal clear what it is you need.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that, because we have had a couple of people, I suppose, asking about how do they go, asking from the more practical aspect of how to sort of get what they need for their portfolio and for their experience. And I think it sounds like it comes back to this, making sure they're looking at the person specification and
make sure
and that they're
looking what's required. Yes.
And don't necessarily get the advice from somebody who was involved in recruitment 15 years ago, because it may be completely different now.
Yeah.
And I think just try to be organised about it. For example, if you do teaching, make sure you get feedback, formal feedback that you can then use as evidence. So just try to be really super organised and really rack your brains to think what experience you actually do have.
Great. So I think that's 1 minute past 8. So I think we're going to have to wrap things up.
Thank you.
But it was great to have you both, Caroline and Naomi. Thank you again so
Thank you
much
very
for
much.
coming
Thank
to
you.
speak to us and our members. So with that, I'll just wrap things up and just to reiterate that this webinar will be available on demand, recorded within the next week, and that certificates for attendance will also be sent out to attendees as well within 5 days. Thank you again for joining us. We look
Thank you.
forward to learning together soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.